So our final speaker, I'd like to welcome to the stage, Anne Dickson. Thank you so much for being with us, Anne. So Anne is a psychologist, writer, and trainer. Her focus for 4 decades has been on gender equality and training in communication skills. And her book, updated in 2022, still uses a handbook for confidence building and personal development around the world. So welcome, Anne, and thank you so much for being with us.
I'll do my best to try and squeeze it into 20 minutes, but it may be a little over. So I've been asked to address you today because of my association with assertiveness training. And I want to begin by telling you a story about something that happened to a colleague named Laura last year. She'd been attending an in-house training program set up especially to look at internal power structures with a view to bringing the organization into line with gender equality goals. After an initial presentation, the participants were split into subgroups of 4. And she found herself with 2 female colleagues and the director of the organization. They'd been instructed to focus their discussion for 30 minutes on their experience of management of power and share any ideas they had and report back. And she described how the director had initiated the discussion, sharing his thoughts on the problems of inequality and how to address them. He then continued speaking for 28 minutes, at which point it was time for them all to rejoin the main group. And on the way back, the 3 women exchanged comments between themselves about the irony, describing his behavior as a perfect example of patriarchal power in operation. All 3 in their 50s, around 50s, were acknowledged leading experts in their own fields: human rights, climate change, and diversity awareness. I knew all of them. They were highly articulate, professional, and very able women. Now, Laura, telling me this story, herself had wondered why none of them had spoken up at the time, and asked me why I thought this was. Why do we keep silent? To answer this question, I need to go back to my early years of teaching assertiveness, because teaching and training in this field has been the source of my learning. Most people today associate assertiveness with a specific set of skills, but for me it was and still is far more radical in its potential, and I see it as a form of activism without being on the streets. Some of you may be familiar with my first book, which was reissued in 2022 after 40 years. As a consequence of it being translated into other languages, I was invited to teach abroad and eventually established training networks abroad as well as in the UK. I initially expected to have to modify the content in different cultural settings, say between women in Denmark or women in Japan. But what emerged, despite linguistic differences, was a common experience of learned patterns of communication and behavioral patterns. When a woman practices how to communicate clearly and directly, she will then be faced with the realization that somehow she's adopted a whole range of patterns of communication, a whole system of false body language, of which she is often not conscious. This includes postures, gestures, eye contact, intonation of speech, choice of vocabulary, and facial expressions. We very rarely, for example, know how often we smile to ward off potential disapproval, how we try and take up as little space as possible, often reflected in a stooped posture or small voice or hesitant words, how often we frame statements as questions or even habitually apologize when we begin to speak. Communication patterns lead to behavior patterns, intense difficulty in clarifying what it is we want to communicate because we're preoccupied with anticipating or imagining what others want, leaving unfair criticism unchallenged, a difficulty in saying no clearly because of the discomfort elicited by the message that to do so is uncaring. And anger often proves very difficult to express clearly because women learn that anger is an ugly and dangerous emotion. So all in all, there's a general tendency to curb our speech, play down our feelings, and doubt the veracity of our experience, a kind of deferential posture, which we aren't conscious of. Now, once these patterns come to light and it becomes clear they're shared by so many others, together with information and encouragement to change, each participant can then move from communicating in a passive or indirect voice and find her own active voice. I've witnessed this again and again and again as women created new spaces for themselves, verbally, physically, and psychologically, generating real self-confidence. The growing puzzle, though, for me, as I continued to work in many different contexts, was that I saw the same unhelpful patterns emerging, the same stumbling blocks, the same fears, the same self-doubts, and the same adaptive patterns. And this is regardless of variations in circumstance. Behind individual stories and varied experiences of upbringing, there was no visible correlation between habitually low self-esteem and circumstances of personality, age, class, or culture. So what was going on? The first glimmer of an answer to the question came as I facilitated courses for women who specifically wanted to learn how to use assertiveness skills in the workplace. Here, there was a whole different range of problems, which were difficult to identify with precision. No gross actions, but subtle actions of microaggression intended to undermine female employees, whatever their positions within the organization. Things like patronizing comments, exclusion from promotion, a male colleague or boss taking credit for a woman's work, unfair criticism, being given tasks below one's pay scale, sexual innuendos, put-downs, or exclusions from important meetings, documents, or decision-making. These things are harder to pinpoint because they're not always direct and obvious. And in addition, the response to a voice protest often implies a lack of humor or overactive imagination or hypersensitivity on the part of the complainant. Today, we're much more accustomed to see high-earning female CEOs, but numerical measures don't reveal the whole story. On one hand, the visible profile of an increasing number of women in high positions generates the official claim that strides towards gender equality have been made. On the other hand, we know that the quantitative assessment falls short of the qualitative experience because those executives don't enjoy an equal working environment. Gender barriers still exist for all working women in the form of external structures like lack of adequate childcare facilities, lack of flexibility on the part of employers. Gender norms continue to operate, with senior women being appraised more negatively than male counterparts or even criticized for not being more like a man in their approach. And juggling the combined demands of family and work, the strain can be enormous, but is rarely discussed, shared, or heard because of a reluctance to appear inadequate and vulnerable in a professional context where the competition can be fierce. So what can we do to address this? The first thing is to open our eyes and look. Handling our individual situations more effectively requires us to see them within a much wider historical context. In other words, I think we have to depersonalize our experience by looking at the bigger picture. Even though you are in the body being commented on, you are the person being excluded or patronized or ignored, you're still only one representative of your gender within a pre-existing centuries-old power structure. The work environment offers a useful microcosm of the endurance of sexist attitudes. It's easy to overlook the fact that it's only relatively recently that women have actually been employed, in paid jobs other than domestic duties. So chronologically, women's presence in the workplace is still a historical novelty. When a woman enters an executive boardroom, she realizes she is an interloper. She's entering male territory. The organizational context may change, political, financial, medical, legal, or commercial, but a woman will have to reckon with entering a male domain and adjusting to the intrinsic values of that domain. How might we describe some of those values? I think many familiar hallmarks in organizational culture emanate from a fixed form of hierarchy. The overriding goal is profit, achievement through competition and battle within an impersonal climate, encouraged by the traditional power structure. As a consequence, dishonesty is rife. Maintaining the appearance of efficiency overrides any admission of ignorance, leading to a blame culture, or the need to find a fall guy to cover up and deny any error or vulnerability. All of this fosters an ethos of self-interest, watching one's back and resorting to all kinds of manipulation to avoid falling foul of the system. The predominant emotion in this kind of climate is fear. Now, some women are happy to subscribe to the system. Some thrive in this kind of environment. I remember a radio interviewer protesting to me relatively recently that assertive communication sounded very boring, that she much preferred the sense of victory that she won in an interaction the other person had lost. So where would be the fun otherwise? However, many women do feel uncomfortable with the prevailing workplace culture. Sometimes they want to establish a different culture that promotes employee well-being. They want to manage authority without aggression. At executive levels, they may be keen to promote diversity, to encourage mentorship and sponsorship of colleagues, or the need for more flexible working conditions to accommodate family needs. We're not all able, though, to challenge the status quo. Some of the examples we've heard this morning are very clear and celebratory examples of how you change the culture of an organization. But it's not always possible, and many find the personal cost too much. Even though we find our voices when confronted with overt hostility, we can become lulled into silence about everyday little things. We're either so used to them that we don't notice, or if we do notice, we feel weary. The prospect of yet again trying to explain the unexplainable and getting nowhere. Adversarial rules enshrined in tradition, by nature of their longevity, are immensely resistant to change. And because it's endured for so long, sexism seems not only normal, but natural. Like the three women in the group in my first story, we have words to describe what's happening. We can name the concepts, but we don't always have the energy to speak up because it can seem futile. The endurance of sexist conditioning, though, isn't the only thing that restricts our capacity to be agents of change. I think what also is important is that it's difficult to imagine anything different. And this, for me, is the core issue of women and leadership. Do women want to maintain and sustain the hierarchical model of power with all its dehumanizing repercussions? Or do women want to guide those they lead on a different path for a different world? Simone de Beauvoir once wrote, "The point is not for women simply to take power out of men's hands, since that wouldn't change anything about the world. It's a question of destroying that notion of power. And I would add it's a question of embracing an alternative model of what power might look like." It's natural to feel reluctant to give up any deeply held conviction if faced only with a vacuum. Leaping into a void is just simply too frightening, so we tend to stay on familiar ground until we can see a clear option ahead. This is why I think it's essential to go beyond ideas and words and demonstrate a different model of power, one without aggression. The word assertive 40 years ago was very new and often confused with aggression. It still is today. In fact, they are essentially different. Aggression always implies a vertical dynamic, whereas assertiveness is grounded in equality. Without an alternative to aim towards, the entrenched competitor winner-loser mindset will continue as the default option because you can't see another way. And as Audre Lorde wisely warned us, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, which is why I believe it's only possible to challenge the monopoly of the patriarchal mindset effectively by exemplifying a different alternative concept of power through one's action. This is what I mean by activism. In other words, moving from concept to lived experience. So I started with look, and now I go on to learn. Replacing aggression with equality in your interactions is a matter of perception and choice. How do you confront someone, for example, who is above you or below you without allowing your behavior to be dictated by your relative position in the hierarchy? If we respond from a top-down or down-up perspective, either an aggressive or passive outcome will be inevitable. So how do we treat the other person as an equal while also staying aware of the contextual difference in power? The answer is to view both realities at once, to develop the capacity for what I call binocular vision. The person who is higher than you is also an equal human being. And so you have the right to challenge, offer a constructive criticism, disagree, ask a question. The person who is lower is also an equal human being and has the right to be heard, respected, and treated without contempt. The two realities can blend together. Once you understand and practice this, it becomes easier, even after centuries of being conditioned by vertical ranking. And each of us is capable of learning how to walk away from winning and settling instead for a mutually respectful outcome. It's a question of learning and choice. This is how one learns to handle perpendicular power without oppression. For example, allowing somebody to express their feelings in response to your decisions without being defensive or backing down. You develop the ability to balance the professional authority vested in you without losing your capacity to respond as an equal human being. We can learn to choose to see both contexts simultaneously. And this actually has a very powerful impact, but it's without injury. This model of power can transform our approach to conflict. All human relationships involve conflict at times because we bump into each other's boundaries. The automatic fear of being the loser in any prospect galvanizes us either to go into battle or deploy strategies to deflect any impact or simply hide, dodge the bullets, depending on the circumstances. If we could reimagine conflict as a period of turbulence and potential change within a relationship, as an opportunity to explore and listen to each other, it would provide an approach that doesn't automatically end in war. We could demonstrate within our personal relationships and in the workplace and show what personal power really looks like. Can we find the courage to do so? Most importantly, can we take courage from one another to model a different kind of power, to inspire others to think beyond the one patriarchal definition? I don't know any of you, but I'm certain that each of you already exemplifies personal power at times. You may just not recognize it as such. See if you can recognize the following examples. Personal power is evident when you don't subjugate yourself to others by giving your power away. You stay firm in your request or statement. It shows when you name your feelings honestly to yourself and to others if you choose, avoiding the temptation to blame. It shows when you can express anger without the need to punish or persecute in response. This means your anger may come across forcefully, leaving others startled, but never hurt or belittled. It shows whenever you can acknowledge your fear, allowing yourself to keep going and congratulating yourself on taking the risk in the first place. It appears in the way you remain open to negotiation, when you can be flexible while also maintaining boundaries for those who need them, even when you're resented for doing so. Finally, it shows when you're prepared to withstand being unpopular and disliked at the cost of being true to yourself and upholding your responsibilities. From look to learn, and now to laugh. To laugh at the sheer mess and absurdity of it all. We strive so hard, and we've been striving for so many centuries, to change the situation, to do the right thing, to please others, to carry burdens, to make a success of everything we take on, and always trying to make the right impression. I began with one story, and I'll end with another one, which illustrates the benefit of seeing one's personal experience within the wider impersonal context. Sally was a participant once in a training workshop I was doing. At the time, she was the director of a huge financial organization in the minority of one in an all-male department. She felt very comfortable being assertive most of the time, but the problem she brought to the group was how to say no effectively to her boss when he asked her on a regular basis to do some very menial task, way below her position and competence. This is a lovely example of the interface between the personal and the impersonal. At one level, we have Sally's individual problem with an individual man, but this wasn't a one-off request, meriting a one-off refusal. This was an example of harassment, a put down by one person in a dominant position in the hierarchy to keep someone else lower down in her place. It's the bigger picture of male entitlement. And this is right at the edges of misogyny. The beginnings of misogyny. It's very much connected. So this explained, given the hugeness of the picture, why after several role play practices she looked exhausted and defeated. What she faced was just too big and too long-standing a problem. In other words, she'd lost what I call her personal power, which easily becomes a casualty when we struggle to stay afloat in a system of hierarchical power. So I suggested we did one more practice, but this time, forget about words, forget about a verbal response. Just listen, allow herself to listen and see what emerged spontaneously. So the scenario was once again reenacted, and she waited. We all waited in silence to see what would emerge. And after a few seconds, she started to laugh. A really deep, low belly laugh that built into a contagious sound that resonated in the belly of every woman in that room. Laughter prompted by the arrogance and the overwhelming absurdity of the whole situation. As her laughter abated, Sally softened, releasing the tension from having to maintain a state of ever-present readiness to do battle, which had previously been her own defense. She could regain her own power in the situation and at the same time disengage from the war, which would only leave her more bruised. She decided to put this into practice and reported back over successive meetings that she was now using laughter as a strategy, more and more frequently. She said her boss and colleagues would look utterly baffled and completely uncertain how to respond, but she could get through it intact. She'd found a way to come back to herself, and this is why I think there is a value in laughter when we're up against overwhelming odds. For a few moments, just to shut everything out and go crazy for a while, and live with the acceptance that others won't always understand us, and that what we're up against is immense. We need to see the bigger picture. Personal change is essential, but there are limits to it. It's then that we need to support each other far more. fighting individual battles can feel terribly lonely. So it's essential to renounce competition and suspicion of each other, to reach through the divisions that separate us, the hierarchical divisions that separate us, because they do often, and to ensure far more cooperation towards a common goal and a new vision. For me personally, feminism goes way beyond equal rights for women. Without full and equal participation in the past or in the present in co-creating our world, our diminished presence has left a huge and significant vacuum. It's an absence. And like the three women listening to the director, our silence means that the culture continues uninterrupted. The vacuum left by our silence over the centuries has enabled the exclusivity of a particular mindset, and some of the long-term consequences of this dominance are glaringly obvious. Today, 2/3 of the world's inhabitants live under the sway of male leaders who display the very worst characteristics of patriarchal authoritarianism: egotism, ruthlessness, and determination to hold on to power by any means of oppression. Violence of all kinds is not the exception, but increasingly the norm, as is tolerance of that violence. This is why I believe an alternative model of power and a radically different model of leadership is urgently needed now, for the sake of every single human being. That's it.